An old taxi sputtered and died, right in front of the iron gates of the Castellano estate in the season's first blizzard, and the woman who stepped out of it had nothing but a thin coat to shield her from the biting cold. Della Whitcomb was 27, her face worn with the weariness of a hard-working life, her hands roughened by years of washing dishes and cleaning rented rooms, yet her green eyes still held a warmth that poverty had never managed to put out. She was late for the last job interview left to her in this world, having spent her very last coin on the fare, and she should have run straight inside before she lost her only chance. But the moment her foot touched the snow, she did something no one expected. She heard someone crying softly in the snow-covered garden, a young blind woman who'd gotten lost when the falling snow stole away the familiar sounds she used to find her way, turning in frightened circles with one hand reaching for a hedge that was no longer there. And Della, a woman who had nothing in the world but that single coat, took it off and wrapped it around the trembling shoulders of a stranger, letting the bone-deep cold tear through her own back. Standing still in the shadow of the porch, a man watched her every move. Roland Castellano was 34, the most powerful boss in Chicago's North Side, a man whose single nod could make the whole city hold its breath, and yet that night he wore the rough clothes of a hired hand, the faint scar above his brow, and his steel-gray eyes hidden beneath the brim of a cap. He'd chosen silence, playing the part of a man who couldn't speak, because he believed that when people think the one before them can't say a word, that's when they reveal who they truly are. He'd seen far too many liars smile at his money and his power, and he'd sworn he would find a true heart for his blind little sister, the only person left in this world he loved. He never expected that tonight, in the middle of a blizzard, that woman would give away the only thing she had to a stranger who could never repay her a thing, and he never expected that the very moment he watched her shiver in the cold, and still manage a warm smile, something locked away in his chest for years would turn, quietly and dangerously. She had no idea who the man in the worker's clothes really was, and she had no idea that she'd just passed a test she never knew she was taking. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that like button to support us. Share this video with the people you love so we can spread a little kindness together, and subscribe to the channel today so you'll never miss a single touching story to come. When the great door of the Castellano mansion opened, warmth from inside rushed out like a gentle wave, and Della nearly buckled from the contrast with the cold that had just been clawing at her bare back. An older man, neat and composed in a gray suit, with silver hair combed carefully into place, hurried forward to support the blind girl Della was still holding close beside her. He was Sal Brennan, the steward who had looked after this house for nearly 30 years, and in the moment he saw Della's only coat draped over the young lady's shoulders, while the stranger herself shivered violently in a thin blouse. Something in his stern eyes softened. He called for a maid to bring warm towels and hot tea, guided the blind girl to sit beside the fireplace, then turned to Della with the low, cautious voice of a man used to judging people through only a few sentences. "You're the one here to interview for the maid's position, aren't you?" he asked, and Della nodded, her calloused hands clasped tightly together to hide the trembling from the cold, answering that her name was Della Whitcomb, and that she was a little late because the taxi had broken down outside the gate. Sal looked at her for a long while, not with harsh suspicion, but with the gaze of someone who had just witnessed something rare, then invited her to sit in the chair across from him in the wide entry hall, where golden lamplight fell across the dark wooden walls, and an old pendulum clock struck its slow beats into the silence. The interview was much shorter than anything Della had imagined all week. Sal did not ask her about diplomas or recommendation letters, because she had none. He asked what work she had done, and Della honestly told him about years spent washing dishes in restaurants, cleaning rooms in cheap hotels, about how she was not afraid of any hard work as long as it was honest. He asked whether she had family, and a brief shadow of grief passed across her face before she softly answered that she had no one left in the world. Sal nodded slowly, and in the heart of the old steward, a decision had already formed from the moment he saw her on the snowy porch. This house had gone through 4 maids in only half a year, and with each one who left, his heart had grown a little heavier, because none of them had been able to stay, or more precisely, none of them had deserved to stay. They had come for the generous wage this distinguished household paid, then treated young Miss Noel with cold indifference, speaking over her head as though she were not there, secretly complaining about having to care for a girl who could not see. Sal had seen enough people like that to know that what this house truly needed was not a pair of capable hands, but a heart, and the woman sitting before him, the woman who had not hesitated to take off her last coat in the middle of a snowstorm and wrap it around the shoulders of a strange girl, without even knowing who she was, had answered the most important question before it was ever asked. "You are new," he said, "without scandal, without ties to anyone, and in this house, that clean anonymity may be the most valuable thing of all." He told her the work could begin that very night if she agreed, that she would have a small private room on the servants' floor, full meals, and a wage that, when Della heard the amount, made her force back the tears gathering in her eyes, because it was more than anything she had ever dared dream of. Sal rose and led her down a long corridor to a small, warm room with a single bed made with pure white sheets and a window overlooking the garden, now buried in snow. As they walked, he added in a careful voice that the master of the house, Mr. Castellano, was currently away on business and would not be present for some time, that people said he was somewhere outside the city, handling important matters, so Della could rest assured that most of her work would revolve only around caring for young Miss Noel and helping with the housework. Della listened and nodded, never knowing that the master she had just heard described as some distant shadow was in fact standing only a few steps away in the darkness at the end of the hallway, silently watching her tired steps, and that the man in the rough work clothes she had only glimpsed on the snowy porch was the very name the whole city still whispered in fear. On her first night in the Castellano mansion, after changing into the dry clothes the kind maid had given her, and warming her stomach with a bowl of hot soup downstairs in the kitchen, Della refused to sit still in her warm little room. She was not used to resting, while her hands and feet were still able to work. And she told herself that if she wanted to keep this precious job, she had to prove she deserved it from the very first moment. So she made her way to the large kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and began cleaning the copper pots hanging from the rack, arranging the pile of dishes the previous servant had left in disorder. It was then that she saw the man in rough work clothes come in through the back door, carrying an armful of firewood and the cold still clinging to his shoulders. She recognized him at once as the man she had glimpsed on the snowy porch when she first arrived, the man Sal had briefly said was named Cole, a hired handyman who took care of repairs and heavy work around the house, and that he could not speak, so she shouldn't find it strange if he never answered. Della watched him set the wood beside the kitchen fireplace, his broad shoulders bending in silence, and instead of turning away to continue her work, as anyone else would have done with a silent hired man, she smiled at him and gave him a gentle nod in greeting. Roland, hidden behind the name Cole and the disguise he had worn for many weeks, paused for an instant before that smile, because he was far too used to people looking through him as though he were a piece of furniture, or worse, looking at him with the awkward unease of those who believed a man who could not speak was surely not worth their concern either. He had meant to finish the task and slip back into the shadows as usual, but Della poured a cup of hot coffee from the pot she had just made, carried it over, placed it on the wooden table beside where he stood, and said in a gentle, natural voice, as though he were any ordinary person in the world, that it must be hard to haul firewood outside in weather this cold, and that he should drink something to warm himself. Roland looked at the steaming cup of coffee, then lifted his eyes to her face, and for one moment he forgot that he was supposed to be playing a part. She did not know who he was, did not know what a cup of coffee offered to a silent hired man might bring her in return, had nothing to gain from that kindness, and yet she gave it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He reached out to take the cup, his fingers accidentally brushing hers, and he noticed that she did not pull away or show discomfort the way others had. He could not thank her, because the role would not allow him to do so he only lowered his head slightly, and Della smiled again, told him it was nothing, then turned back to her stack of dishes. As she worked, she continued speaking to him in that soft voice, not minding at all that he could not answer a single word, telling him how glad she was to have found this work, that she had never seen a house so warm in the middle of such a bitter night, that she would try her very best not to disappoint Mr. Sal after he had trusted her enough to take her in. Roland stood there with the warm cup of coffee in his hand, silently listening to this woman speak to him as though speaking to a friend, and he realized something that made his chest ache in a strange way, that during all the weeks he had worn this silent disguise to test people's hearts, he had never once met anyone who treated the shadow of a hired man named Cole with such sincere kindness, without calculation, without even a trace of condescension. The previous maids had either ignored him, ordered him around in arrogant voices, or studied him with suspicious eyes. But this woman, who had nothing in her hands except calloused palms, and a heart poverty had not managed to harden, treated him as though he too were a person worthy of care. After she finished cleaning and wished him good night before returning to her room, Roland still stood motionless for a long time in the empty kitchen, the cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, and for the first time in many years, the man the whole city feared found himself bewildered by something so simple. The next morning, once Della had begun to grow used to the long hallways and spacious rooms of the mansion, Sal assigned her main duty, caring for and keeping company with the young mistress, and for the first time, she had a chance to sit down and truly talk with the girl she had helped into the house in the middle of the snowstorm the night before. Noelle, a 19-year-old girl with soft brown hair and sightless eyes, was rather guarded at first, because she had grown used to maids coming and going, with no one truly wanting to stay beside her. But there was something in Della's warm voice that slowly made her open her heart. While cleaning the large sitting room, Della noticed a grand piano in the corner, glossy black, its cover filmed with a thin layer of dust that showed no one had touched it in a long time, and when she casually asked whether anyone in the house played, she saw Noelle's face sink a little. The girl quietly answered that she used to play, that music had once been her whole world, but from the day her eyes sank into darkness because of the cruel illness that stole her sight when she was 18, she had not dared place her hands on the keys again, because she was afraid she would play wrong. Afraid the music that had once been beautiful would now become distorted beneath the hands of someone who could no longer see the sheet music. Della fell silent for a moment before the sorrow in the girl's voice. Then, instead of offering the empty comfort so many others would have given, she pulled a chair closer, took Noelle's hand, and placed it against the wooden tabletop before them. She told Noelle to close her eyes, though that no longer meant very much, and simply feel. Then she began tapping her fingers against the table, first with a slow and simple melody, each beat traveling through the grain of the wood to the girl's loosely resting fingertips. Noelle startled slightly, then listened in silence through touch, and Della told her gently that music did not live only in the eyes. It lived in the hands, in the heart, in the vibrations we could touch. That a person who could not see the keys could still feel rhythm flowing through the body of the wood, just as Noelle was feeling it now. She tapped a brighter melody, her fingers dancing across the table, and told Noelle to place her whole hand over hers so she could feel every rise and fall, every pause, every quickening beat. Noelle obeyed, her small hand resting on the back of Della's, and when she felt that cheerful melody dancing beneath her fingertips, something miraculous happened. The corner of the girl's mouth trembled, then a laugh burst out, clear and unexpected, the first true laugh to rise from her chest after all those months drowned in silence and shame. Noelle laughed, then asked Della to place her hands on the real piano keys. She wanted to try again. Della guided her to the piano, wiped away the dust, lifted the lid, and placed the girl's trembling fingers on the black and white keys. Della tapped a rhythm on Noelle's shoulder so she could feel the tempo, and the first scattered notes sounded, hesitant at first, then gradually joining together. And though it was only a simple, clumsy melody, to Noelle it was more precious than any perfect piece she had ever played when her eyes could still see. Standing at the doorway with a toolbox in his hand, Roland kept his head low, focusing on his tools, but his heart missed a beat when his sister's laughter drifted through the air. It was a sound he thought he had lost forever from the day darkness crashed down upon her life. And though he did not look up to break the moment, the hard man's chest tightened, and an emotion he had buried for a long time rose with a sharp sting behind his nose. When he returned to his small room that night, Roland sat down at the old table, took out a scrap of paper and a pen, and began to write, his trembling lines expressing gratitude to the woman who had given his sister back her laughter. But after only a few lines, he stopped, because he knew he could not give it to her, could not reveal that a silent hired man could write words like these, and in the end he crumpled the paper in his fist. Sitting motionless in the late-night lamplight, with a feeling he could not put into words, in the days that followed, the friendship between Della and Noelle grew as quickly as a young sprout, finding warm sunlight, and one morning, after the snow had stopped falling and a fragile wash of sun shone through the glass panes, Della led the young woman out to the small greenhouse at the end of the garden, where green rows of herbs had once been tended by the gardener. At first, Noelle hesitated, because she had grown used to people guiding her, as though guiding something fragile, constantly telling her to be careful with every step, always worrying so excessively that it made her feel useless. But Della was different. She did not grab Noelle's hand and drag her along, nor did she speak to her with pity. She only placed the girl's hand on the pots of herbs and spoke to her with a bright excitement, as though the two of them were close friends discovering something wonderful together. She told Noelle that today she would learn how to recognize each plant without needing her eyes, that every herb had its own story told through scent and the shape of its leaves. She guided Noelle's hand to a branch with small, sturdy leaves, told her to gently rub one leaf between two fingers and lift it to her nose, and when the warm, strong fragrance rose, Noelle exclaimed that it smelled like the roasted chicken her mother used to make, and Della laughed and told her it was rosemary, a plant with sharp little leaves like tiny needles lined along the stem. Then she led Noelle to another pot, placed her hand on broader, softer leaves, and when the girl rubbed one and smelled it, a cool, sweet fragrance spread out and made her laugh with delight. "That's basil," Della said, "a plant with rounded leaves as smooth as velvet." In that way, they moved from one pot to another, Della letting Noelle touch for herself, smell for herself, guess for herself, and each time the girl guessed correctly, Della clapped and cheered as though she had done something extraordinary, not with false praise meant for someone disabled, but with the sincere joy of a friend. When they reached the mint, and its unmistakable cool scent rushed up, Noelle recognized it at once and burst into laughter, saying that now she could walk through this greenhouse by herself without anyone leading her, because her hands and her nose had learned how to see in place of her eyes. Della took the girl's hand and said that was exactly right, that from now on this garden belonged to Noelle, that she could come here any time and read it with her own senses, passing by the outside of the greenhouse with a bundle of tools. Roland paused as the muffled sound of their cheerful voices reached him. Through the frosted glass, he caught a glimpse of his sister, the girl who for so many months had only sat curled up in one place, with her sad face lowered, now standing straight among the rows of plants, her face lifted toward the sunlight, her hands moving confidently over the leaves, laughing brightly like an ordinary 19-year-old young woman, the way she should have been allowed to live. It had been far too long since he had seen his sister so alive, far too long since he had seen in her the vitality he had thought that illness had extinguished forever. And he understood then that what the girl had lacked all this time was not devoted care or the money he had poured out to hire people, but someone willing to see her as a whole person, not as a pitiful creature who needed to be protected, but as an equal friend who deserved to laugh, to learn, and to explore the world. Roland stood there long after the two women had gone, watching the rows of herbs sway faintly in the cold breeze, and, for the first time since that fateful day, he dared to believe that perhaps his sister still had a bright future ahead of her, and that the woman who had just stepped into this house might be the miracle he had been searching for all this time, without daring to hope. One afternoon a few days later, when the two women were together again in the greenhouse, Noelle said she wanted to cut some rosemary and basil herself to bring into the kitchen, because she had now grown confident enough to do things she would never have dared dream of before, and Della happily agreed, placing a small pair of scissors in her hand and guiding her on how to follow the stem to find the right branch to cut. While Noelle was absorbed in her task, Della reached for another basket on a high shelf, but her hand accidentally knocked against a glass jar of seeds, and the jar fell to the tile floor and shattered into sharp pieces. By reflex, Della quickly bent down to gather the broken glass, before Noelle could be hurt if she accidentally stepped closer, and in her haste to collect the pieces, a razor-sharp shard sliced a long cut across her palm, and warm blood immediately began to seep out. She drew in a small breath from the pain but instantly bit her lip to hold it back, because she heard Noelle turn toward the sound of the shattering glass in alarm, asking what had happened, whether anyone was hurt. Della knew that if the girl found out the broken jar, and this wound had anything to do with her, with the fact that she had been standing too close or had done something wrong, Noelle would be tormented and blame herself, would sink again into that shameful belief that she was a burden, someone who brought trouble to others. So Della swallowed the pain inside, hid her bleeding hand behind her back, and spoke in a calm, cheerful voice, saying that it was nothing, that she had only clumsily dropped an empty jar, that it was her own fault for being awkward and no one else's, and that Noelle should just keep going and not worry. Hearing that, Noelle relaxed and laughed, teasing that it turned out Della was just as clumsy as she was, then turned back to her herb sprigs, completely unaware that the woman who had become like a new sister to her was holding back pain, using the hem of her blouse to wrap around her bleeding hand and hide the wound. But someone had seen everything. Roland, silently checking the heating system in the corner of the greenhouse, under the disguise of the hired man named Cole, had witnessed the whole moment, from the instant the jar fell and shattered, to the shard slicing into her hand, to the way she immediately hid her own pain and took all the blame onto herself, only so the blind girl would not have to carry even a moment of guilt in her heart. He saw her secretly wipe away the drops of blood, saw her face pale with pain while her mouth still smiled, and spoke as though nothing had happened, and something inside him tightened. He stepped closer, quiet as always, and as he passed beside her, he took from his pocket a clean white handkerchief, an item an ordinary hired man would rarely carry, though he always kept one with him out of an old habit, and held it out to her without saying a word. Della looked up at him, and in the moment their eyes met, she understood at once that he had seen everything, that he knew about the wound she was trying to hide, that he understood why she had lied to the girl. She hesitated for a moment, then brought out her bleeding hand, accepted the handkerchief from him, and whispered a thank you softly enough that Noelle could not hear. Roland only nodded slightly, but in his usually cold gray eyes there was a softened light that even he had not expected, and between those two people, a deep understanding had begun to take root, the kind of understanding that needed no words, because both of them had just recognized something strangely alike in the other, that they were both people used to hiding their own pain so they could carry the harder part themselves, both people willing to suffer loss so someone else could have peace of mind. She tightened the handkerchief around the wound, and when she turned back to Noelle, she still did not know that the silent man who had just given her that cloth had quietly engraved that moment into his heart, or that from then on, he no longer saw her only as someone kind to his sister, but as something much larger than that. As Christmas drew near, the entire city of Chicago wrapped itself in a brilliant festive cloak, and one weekend afternoon, Della asked Sal for permission to take Noelle to the outdoor Christmas market along the shore of Lake Michigan, because she believed that a girl who had learned to read an entire garden with her hands deserved to immerse herself in the lively world of music, fragrance, and laughter outside, instead of forever keeping herself shut within four walls. Sal was worried at first, but when he saw the rare eagerness on the young mistress's face, he finally nodded and agreed, giving careful instructions and ordering a car prepared. The market truly was a magical world to Noelle, and Della guided her past each stall, describing everything in an absorbed voice. The glittering strings of lights hung overhead, the giant Christmas tree standing brightly decorated in the middle of the square, the booths selling all manner of things, from warm wool scarves to delicate handmade ornaments. Noelle breathed in the scent of cinnamon and hot apple cider spreading through the air, listened to the violin of a street musician, mingling with the jingling of bells, and the girl smiled radiantly, her hands tracing the soft fabrics hanging at the stalls, sometimes letting out delighted little exclamations when she touched something unfamiliar. Watching that joy, Della felt warmth fill her own heart as well, because it had been so long since she had felt such simple happiness, the happiness of sharing joy with someone she truly cared for. In the shadows behind them, Roland still followed the two from a safe distance, still playing the role of the hired man sent along to carry things and keep watch, but his sharp eyes never left his sister and the woman who had brought that smile back to her face. Everything remained peaceful until disaster suddenly struck. At one corner of the market, where a stall selling grilled food had glowing charcoal braziers and racks of fragrant sausages. A gas cylinder suddenly exploded because of a leak, and flames roared up violently, licking at the canvas awning of the stall before quickly spreading to the neighboring booths. In the blink of an eye, a corner of the market that had been so full of cheer sank into chaos, the terrified crowd surging and scattering in every direction, screams ringing everywhere, stalls knocked over, and thick black smoke billowing upward until it blurred the evening sky. Della, who had been looking at a booth a few steps away, was shoved aside by the panicked crowd, and when she finally managed to steady herself, horror seized her as she realized that Noelle's hand had slipped from hers at some point in that crush of bodies. She swept her eyes wildly through the sea of people running back and forth, and then her heart seemed to stop when she saw Noelle on the other side, not far from where the flames were spreading. The blind girl stood rooted amid the pushing crowd, both hands reaching helplessly through the air, her face white with terror as the explosion and the shouting stole away all the familiar sounds she depended on to find her way. Noelle was completely disoriented. She did not know where the exit was, did not know which direction the fire was coming from, only stood there calling Della's name in vain, surrounded by a world of chaotic sound she could no longer understand. Della did not hesitate for even a second. She shoved her own fear aside and rushed against the stream of people fleeing, forcing her way through bodies crashing against her, her eyes fixed only on the small trembling figure of the blind girl in the smoke and flames. Someone grabbed her arm and told her she had to run out, not rush in, but she wrenched herself free, because in that moment nothing mattered more to her than reaching Noelle, pulling the girl out of danger before it was too late. And in another corner of the chaotic market, Roland had also realized that his sister was in danger, and the heart of that man clenched with a fear he had long believed he was no longer capable of feeling. He too began to run, but in the packed sea of people, he was much farther away than Della, and he could only watch helplessly as that woman risked herself and fought through the crowd to save the most precious person in his life. A few days after the incident at the market, while Della's shoulder still throbbed beneath the bandage she had wrapped around it herself, a quiet morning in the mansion was suddenly broken by the arrival of uninvited visitors. Della was sweeping the snow from the front steps near the gate when she saw a gleaming black car stop outside the iron fence, and from it stepped 3 unfamiliar men, dressed politely, yet carrying a cold air that sent an indescribable unease crawling up her spine. They approached the gate, and one of them, the one who seemed to be the leader, with a hard, sharp face and resentful eyes, asked her whether this was the Castellano mansion and whether the master of the house was at home. Della did not clearly understand who these men were, but the instinct of a woman who had endured too many hardships in life told her that they had not brought anything good, that the way their eyes moved around the house was not harmless curiosity, but the searching gaze of men hunting for something. In that moment, the first thing that appeared in her mind was not her own safety, but Noelle, the blind girl sitting at the piano in the sitting room behind her, and Della understood that she absolutely must not let these men know about the girl's existence or anything that could place her in danger. So she kept her face calm, put on the bewildered expression of an ordinary worker who knew nothing, and answered that she was only a temporary cleaner newly hired for the holidays, that she did not know who the master was, and had no idea where he might be, that she had heard the master had gone far from the city, long ago, to handle business matters, and that the house now had only a few servants watching over it. The leader narrowed his eyes and stared at her, trying to find some sign of lying on her face, but Della had grown too used to hiding her feelings after years of hardship, and the honest weariness of a poor laboring woman on her face gave him nothing suspicious to seize upon. He asked who else was inside the house, and Della kept her voice casual as she answered that there were only a few old servants and a steward, no one worth their concern. One of the 3 men swept his eyes toward the back courtyard, where the figure of a strong hired worker could faintly be seen silently chopping firewood. His hat pulled low to cover his face, but the man only glanced once and looked away, because in his eyes, that figure was nothing more than a common laborer like any other servant, a nameless shadow not worth attention. None of the 3 could have imagined that the man bending over the firewood in those stained work clothes was Roland Castellano himself. the name they were desperately hunting all over the city, because the silent, ordinary disguise concealed him so perfectly that even enemies who had once stood face to face with him could not recognize him. Roland kept his head down and continued chopping, each stroke of the axe steady, but all his senses were stretched tight as a bowstring, his ears listening to every word exchanged at the gate, and, within him, rose astonishment mingled with admiration as he watched that woman, who knew nothing of his dangerous underworld, calmly answer those threatening men with such wisdom, skillfully leading them away in order to protect Noelle, without knowing that she was standing before men capable of bringing unimaginable disaster. In the end, after probing and finding nothing, the leader let fall a cold warning that if she happened to hear anything about the master, it would be best for her to tell them, adding a look of silent threat that chilled Della to the bone, and then all three men got back into the car and drove away. Only when the black car had disappeared completely beyond the bend did Della dare to release a long breath, leaning against the icy iron gate, her heart still pounding fiercely, and she had no idea that from the back courtyard, the gray eyes of the silent man were watching her with a worry and a deep respect he had never felt before. That night, when the whole mansion had fallen asleep and cold moonlight silvered the snow covering the garden outside, Roland shed the disguise of the silent hired man and returned to his true self inside the hidden room where he concealed his second life. He sat beside the telephone, called the most loyal men in his circle, and in the low, cold, commanding voice of a boss, he ordered them to investigate to the roots the three men who had dared come all the way to his door that day. He knew perfectly well whose men they were, knew which enemy stood behind them, and he understood that if they had managed to trace their way here, then the noose was tightening closer than he had believed. But what weighed on his heart that night was not fear for his own safety, because he had lived too long in danger to still know how to fear for himself, but a completely new worry, an emotion he had never tasted in this way before, a fear for the two women sleeping peacefully under his roof. He was used to protecting Noelle. That was his duty and the blood-deep love he would trade his life to preserve. But now another face rose in his mind as well, the tired yet warm face of the woman who had calmly stood between his enemies and his sister, the woman who had no idea what kind of danger she had just faced, the woman who had used her own body to shield Noelle in the middle of fire and chaos, without once thinking of herself. Roland realized that the thought of Della being harmed because of his enemies, he tightened his chest in a way he could not explain, and in that quiet moment, deep in the night, the hardest man in Chicago was forced to admit to himself, a truth he had been trying to avoid for far too long, that he was not merely grateful to that woman, but had truly come to feel something deep for her, and that from now on, her safety mattered to him no less than his own blood. He spent most of that night silently weaving an invisible net around the house, ordering guards strengthened from a distance, placing loyal men among the roads leading to the mansion, building an unseen wall around the two women, without either of them knowing. And when those probing men tried to linger around the area again in the following days to continue searching, Roland handled everything quietly from the shadows himself, using his power and his network to sever every trail that might lead them closer to Noelle and Della, forcing them to give up and withdraw, all of it unfolding so smoothly and silently that the two women inside the house had no idea how great a danger they had just been protected from. By day, he still wore the clothes of the silent hired man, still lowered his head to chop firewood and make repairs around the house, still quietly watched every step Della took as she cared for his sister. But now that silence carried a new resolve, a wordless vow that he would not allow anything to harm this woman, no matter what he had to give in exchange. Some nights he stood silently outside her bedroom door, not to spy, but only to make certain she was safe, and he wondered when he would ever be able to remove this mask and tell her the truth, to let her know that the silent hired man she had treated with such kindness was in fact carrying an entire world she could not imagine. But each time that thought stirred, fear held him back. The fear that when the truth came to light, the warm gaze she had always given him would change forever, that she would look at him not as a man, but as a monster from the underworld, and that he would lose the rare light that had only just begun to slip into his dark life. So he remained silent, continued protecting her from the shadows, carrying inside him a love he did not yet dare to name, and a secret he knew he would have to face sooner or later. the deep bruise on Della's shoulder, a painful souvenir from the day she shielded Noelle from the exploding gas cylinder at the market, had only grown worse. Refusing to complain, she had kept it hidden beneath her uniform to continue her chores. But one evening, while lifting a heavy stack of bedsheets in the laundry room, she could not hold back a groan of pain and dropped the whole pile onto the floor. Roland, who was repairing the hinge of a nearby door under the disguise of coal, heard it at once and stepped inside. Seeing her pale face and the way she cradled her arm, he knew instantly that her selfless rescue at the market had left a deeper toll than she cared to admit. He could not say a word, but he gestured for her to sit in the nearby chair, then went to get the first aid kit whose location he knew well, bringing with him a basin of warm water and several clean bandages. At first, Della shyly refused, saying she was fine, but the determined look in the silent man's eyes made her give in, and she gently pulled the fabric of her blouse down to reveal a large patch of deep purple, bruising on her shoulder, so severe that even she was startled when she saw it. Roland began gently cleaning and soothing the wound, and in the very moment he focused on caring for her, he forgot that he was playing the role of an ordinary hired man. His hands moved with a strange skill and certainty, not the clumsiness of a laborer used only to rough work, but the calm mastery of someone accustomed to giving orders and controlling every situation. And when he lifted her arm to wrap the bandage, the gesture carried a natural authority, the confidence of a man who had never once in his life had to bow before anyone. Della, who was perceptive by nature, began to sense that something was wrong. When he reached out to support her shoulder, she accidentally touched his palm, and she froze, because it was not the rough, heavily calloused hand of a man who chopped firewood and did hard labor all year as she had believed, but a hand that, though strong, had strangely smooth skin, nails neatly trimmed and clean, without any of the hard calluses that should have belonged to a hired man who worked himself to exhaustion every day. She lifted her eyes and studied him, and at that very moment, when he reached for another strip of bandage, the rough sleeve of his work shirt slid up a little, revealing at his wrist a polished metal watch of exquisite craftsmanship, the kind of expensive watch no ordinary worker could hope to afford even after a lifetime of back-breaking labor. Della only caught a brief glimpse of it before he quickly pulled his sleeve down to cover it, but that image had already etched itself into her mind like a note out of tune in a melody she thought she knew. While he was concentrating on bandaging her, a maid happened to pass by the laundry room door, and Della noticed that when the girl met Cole's eyes, she instinctively lowered her head, a brief but unmistakable gesture of respect, the kind of bow people gave to someone above them, not to a hired worker of equal standing. Della began silently fitting those strange pieces together in her mind, the way he carried an imposing presence that no work clothes could fully hide, the way the other servants in the house seemed to fear and respect him more than necessary, the hands without calluses, the costly watch, and the way he stood with his back straight and his head high even while doing the lowest tasks, as though the whole world had always been meant to revolve around him. She said nothing aloud, but in her intelligent green eyes a great question had begun to kindle, and she looked at the silent man bending over to tend her wound with an entirely different gaze now, the gaze of someone who had just realized that what she had been seeing all this time might not be the whole truth. Roland, absorbed in bandaging her, only realized when he looked up and met that searching gaze that he had revealed too much, and in the moment their eyes met, both of them remained silent, but something between them had changed. An unspoken question now hung in the air, and Roland understood that the disguise he had worked so hard to preserve had begun to crack beneath this woman's sharp eyes. Only a few days later, on a gray afternoon, another visitor came to the Castellano mansion, but this time it was not a group of secretive spies, but a dignified man who strode straight inside with the confidence of someone entering his own home. His name was Gerald Pike, a powerful businessman who had long coveted the profitable harbor district held by the Castellano family, and he had waited for an opportunity like this for a very long time, ever since rumors had spread through the underworld business circles that boss Roland Castellano had been forced to flee the city and hide somewhere far away after a purge, leaving his estate without anyone truly in command. Pike was certain. This was the golden moment to force the boss's family to sign a harbor transfer contract with terms favorable to him, because he believed that when the tiger was away, The whole house held only weak women and aging servants, with no strength to resist. He had no idea that the very man he was trying to outmaneuver was standing in the back courtyard of the house at that moment, wearing the stained work clothes of a silent hired man, quietly listening to every word through a half-open window. Sal received him with caution, but Pike did not bother paying any attention to the old steward. He strode into the sitting room and slapped a folder of documents onto the table, loudly declaring that he had come to discuss business and needed a signature from a representative of this family that very day. At that moment, Noelle was sitting beside the piano, and when she heard that strange, arrogant voice, the girl quietly stopped playing and turned toward the sound. Pike swept his eyes around the room, and when his gaze stopped on the blind girl sitting there with eyes that saw nothing, a contemptuous smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. In a mocking voice, he asked Sal whether the representative of the distinguished Castellano family was truly a blind girl, then gave a cold laugh and said it was a waste of time, because someone who could not even see what was in front of her could hardly understand the complicated business of adults, and it would be best for her to sit quietly and play the piano while clear-minded people handled matters. Those cruel words struck straight into the girl's dignity like knives, but instead of lowering her head and silently enduring it as Pike expected, Noelle slowly rose from the piano bench, her face lifted with calm composure, and she answered with a sharpness that made the entire room fall silent. She said that yes, her eyes could not see light, but precisely because of that she heard very clearly, and what she had just heard from his mouth told her that he had not come here to discuss honest business, but to take advantage of her family's hardship for his own gain, and that a man who had to humiliate a blind girl in order to feel powerful probably did not possess the clear mind he was so proud of. She added that although she could not see his face, she could judge the kind of man he was perfectly well by the way he behaved, and what she sensed right now gave her no reason to respect him at all. Pike froze before the girl's firm reply, his face flushing for an instant, because he had been exposed so directly by someone he had looked down on. But he quickly recovered his arrogance and said through clenched teeth that no matter how cleverly she spoke, this family would still have to sign his contract in the end, because he held enough in his hands to leave them with no other choice. Behind the half-open window in the back courtyard, Roland heard every word, and a cold rage rose inside him as he watched this man dare come all the way into his home to humiliate his sister. But at the same time, pride surged through him as he heard Noelle answer with such strength. He tightened his grip on the axe handle in his hand, forcing himself not to storm out, because he knew this was not yet the moment to reveal his identity, and something told him that this situation might be resolved in a way even he had not expected. Just as Pike was smugly waving the contract folder in his hand and loudly demanding a signature, Della stepped into the sitting room with the tea tray Sal had asked her to bring in, and she immediately sensed the tense atmosphere and the hurt Noelle was trying to hold back on her face. She set the tray down, moved to stand beside the girl like a quiet shield, and when her eyes happened to pass over the folder lying on the table, an old professional habit she had thought long asleep suddenly awakened inside her. Because Della had not always been a maid. Before life drove her into hardship and desperation, she had once been a promising law student, had spent her younger years buried in legal codes and contracts, until she was forced to abandon her dream of the classroom in order to care for her sick younger brother. That knowledge had never truly left her, and now, as her eyes moved across the lines of Pike's contract, she immediately noticed the irregularities. She quietly asked for permission to look over the documents, and Pike, thinking she was nothing more than a harmlessly curious maid, gave a contemptuous laugh and told her to go ahead, because even if she looked at it, she would not understand a thing. But Della picked up the contract, her eyes moving swiftly over each clause with the sharpness of someone properly trained, and after only a few minutes, she lifted her head and looked straight at him with a calm smile. She began pointing out that the notary seal stamped on the contract showed extremely suspicious signs, that the notary identification number written there did not match the standard format used by legitimate notary offices in the state of Illinois, and that the placement and manner of the stamp strongly suggested it was a forged seal made to deceive people who did not understand the law. Pike's face went pale, but Della did not stop there. She turned to the following pages, and calmly pointed out that the transfer clause he had inserted into the contract directly violated Illinois real estate law, governing the transfer of commercial property, that an agreement like this, if brought before a court, would be declared invalid at once, and that anyone who deliberately pressured another person to sign a document bearing such a forged seal could face charges of fraud and document forgery, which were not minor crimes at all. She said all of this in a calm yet powerful voice, never raising her tone, yet every sentence and every word was sharp as a blade, and she concluded that if Pike truly wanted to discuss business properly, he should bring a lawful contract with a real seal, but if he intended to take advantage of the master's absence to use false documents to force a blind girl to sign an illegal paper, then she feared he had chosen the wrong house and the wrong person for his tricks. Gerald Pike stood frozen, his face turning red and then pale, because he could not have imagined that the plan he had carefully arranged would be exposed down to its roots by a poor maid, and still less could he have imagined that the plainly dressed woman before him would understand the law so well that he could not argue back with a single word. He stammered, trying to make excuses, trying to threaten loudly as he always did, but beneath Della's calm, confident gaze and Noelle's quiet composure beside her, all his arrogance suddenly became ridiculous and hollow. In the end, unable to bear the humiliation, he hurriedly gathered up the folder, growled that this matter was not over, and hastily retreated from the house with the pathetic air of a man who had arrived with bluster, only to leave with his tail between his legs. When the great door slammed shut behind him, Noelle turned and threw her arms around Della, choking out her thanks for standing up to protect her and protect the whole family, while Della only gently comforted the girl and said she had simply done what was right. Behind the half-open door near the back courtyard, Roland had heard every word, and he stood motionless in utter astonishment. He had known that this woman possessed a rare and compassionate heart, had known she was brave and rich in sacrifice, but he had never imagined that behind the worn appearance of a poor maid, there was such a keen intelligence hidden away, a mind capable of defeating even a seasoned schemer like Pike, with nothing but knowledge and composure. And in that moment, the feeling he held for her deepened even further, because he realized that this woman was not only the miracle he had searched for on behalf of his sister, but also an extraordinary person whom a cruel fate had buried, a precious gem hidden beneath the dust of poverty. The following evening, when Noelle accidentally slipped on the steps and lightly scraped her knee, Della hurried to find the first aid kit so she could bandage the girl, but the medicine box usually kept in the kitchen had run completely out of gauze, and Sal, who was busy at the time, told her to go up to the master's study on the upper floor, where a fully stocked first aid kit was always kept in a cabinet drawer, and said she should go in and take it freely because this was an urgent situation. Following his directions, Della stepped into the large study where she had never set foot before, a solemn room with bookshelves rising all the way to the ceiling and the faint scent of oak and leather lingering in the air. She was not a curious person by nature, and the only thought in her mind at that moment was to quickly find the medical kit and return downstairs to Noelle, so she went straight to the cabinet Sal had mentioned. But when she opened the drawer and took out the first aid kit, her eyes accidentally swept across the shelf beside it, where a family photograph sat in a place of honor, visible to anyone who entered the room. Della froze, because in that photograph was a tall man standing beside a young girl, and though the girl in the picture was a little younger than she was now, Della recognized at once that it was Noelle, with a radiant smile and eyes that at that time were still clear and able to see the light. But what made Della's heart pound was not Noelle, but the man standing beside her, the man with a powerful build, a faint scar near his left eyebrow, and those cold gray eyes, a face that, though captured in an elegant suit and the commanding bearing of a powerful gentleman, Della could not possibly mistake, because it was the very face of Cole, the silent hired man, who chopped firewood and made repairs around the house every day, the man who had given her a handkerchief in the greenhouse, the man who had quietly bandaged the wound on her shoulder. Della stood rooted to the floor, her mind spinning as she tried to deny what her eyes were seeing, but then her gaze fell upon the desk nearby, where a stack of documents had been left open, and on them was a signature written in a hand so familiar that it startled her. She recognized that handwriting at once. because she had once glimpsed it when she accidentally found a crumpled scrap of paper Cole had dropped near his room. A scrap of paper she had not had the heart to read carefully and had put back where it was, but the trembling, emotional strokes on it had remained in her memory. And now those same distinctive strokes appeared beneath a name written clearly on the documents, the name Roland Castellano. Della felt as though the ground beneath her feet had swayed, as all the scattered pieces from these past days suddenly locked together in her mind with a chilling perfection. The hands without calluses, the expensive watch, the commanding presence that could not be hidden, the way the servants in the house bowed their heads to him with respect, the rumor of an absent master she had never met. All of it now appeared with painful clarity, like a picture whose veil had been lifted. The silent hired man named Cole, whom she had treated with kindness all these days, the man for whom she had unknowingly begun to feel a quiet tenderness, had never been mute at all, and had never been a poor hired worker. He was Roland Castellano, the master of this house, the most powerful boss on the north side of Chicago, the man the entire city feared, the man those dangerous strangers had been desperately hunting. Della shakily set the first aid kit down, her hands turning icy cold, and a tangle of emotions surged through her heart, confusion, shock, and somewhere within it all, a sharp ache as she realized that all this time, the person she thought she had begun to understand, the person to whom she had offered sincere kindness, and even the first stirrings of her heart, had in truth been hiding an enormous secret from her. She did not know what she was supposed to feel, did not know whether she had unknowingly been drawn into some kind of performance, and standing in the silent study, with the family photograph gazing quietly at her from the shelf, Della understood that everything between her and that man would never be the same again. Della found him in the back courtyard, still in those stained work clothes, quietly stacking firewood under the yellow light spilling from the kitchen window, and she walked straight up to him with the family photograph clutched tightly in her hand, her green eyes, usually so warm, now shining with a hurt and anger she could no longer hide. She set the photograph down on the wooden table between them and asked in a trembling voice who the man in this picture was, and whether he still intended to go on, pretending to be mute in front of her. Roland lifted his head, and when he saw the photograph and the look in her eyes, he understood that the moment he had always feared had finally arrived. For an instant, he still hesitated, but then he set the axe down, straightened to his full height, and for the first time since that snowy night, he spoke in front of her, his voice deep, warm, clear, and full of authority, entirely different from the silence he had worn for so long. He said she was right, that he was not mute, and that he was Roland Castellano, the master of this house. Hearing that voice come from the very mouth of the man she had believed could not speak, Della stepped back as though she had been struck in the chest, and all the emotions pent up inside her broke open. Through tears, she asked him whether all this time had been nothing but a performance, whether he had stood there behind that silent disguise, watching her the way one might watch an animal in a cage, testing how a poor, lowly maid would behave when she thought no one worth noticing was looking. She said she had given the man named Cole the most sincere kindness she had in her heart, had worried about him, had made coffee for him on cold nights, had seen him as an equal human being worthy of respect, and yet it turned out that all along he had only been judging her, weighing and measuring whether she would pass his silent test. Her voice choked as she said that what hurt her most was not that he was wealthy or powerful, not that he was a boss of the underworld, but that he had turned the most honest moments between them into a kind of amusement, an experiment she had not even known she was part of. Roland tried to step closer, his voice urgent as he explained that it was not what she thought, that he had never once seen her as amusement, but at that very moment, another voice rang out from the doorway, making them both freeze. It was Noelle, who had followed the sound of their argument and found her way out there, her face white, her lips trembling. She had been standing there long enough to hear her brother's voice, the voice she had thought she would never hear again since learning he had gone far away, and now, in shock, she realized that the silent hired man named Cole, who had been around her all this time, was actually Roland, the brother she loved and missed without end. Through all those weeks, he had deliberately avoided her, never coming close enough for her to touch him, always keeping absolute silence, because his voice was the very thing a blind person like her would recognize most easily. even changing the familiar scent he used to carry, so she could not recognize him by smell, and that cruelly careful distance had kept her from knowing that the brother she longed for day and night had been right beside her all along. Noelle burst into tears, choking as she asked him why he had hidden even from her, why he had let her miss him, let her worry for him all these days while he was here and said nothing. Roland stood between the two women, on one side the blood sister, who had just discovered she had been deceived by her brother, on the other the woman he secretly loved, who had just realized that everything had been a mask. And for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Chicago felt utterly helpless, not knowing where to begin to mend the cracks his own lies had made. Della could bear no more. She shook her head, letting the tears stream down her face, then turned and ran toward the porch, rushing into the cold white night of snow, leaving behind the man and all the shattered truths that had just come to light. Roland followed Della out to the porch, where she stood leaning against the snow-covered railing, her shoulders trembling beneath her thin clothes in the skin cutting cold of the winter night. And this time he hid nothing anymore. He draped the warm coat he had just grabbed over her shoulders and called her name in his real voice, begging her to give him one chance to explain before she decided to leave this place. Della did not turn around, but she did not walk away either, and Roland understood that this was all he could hope for in that moment. He began to speak in a low, hoarse voice, filled with all the weariness and pain he had carried in silence for so many years, telling her that he had never intended to turn her into an amusement or a test subject. He told her about the world he lived in, a world where he had never once known sincerity, where every smile aimed at him concealed some calculation, where every person who came near him carried a purpose, either money, power, or the protection that the Castellano name could bring. He said that in that world of lies, the only thing left pure and worth trading everything for was Noelle, the sister he had raised and protected since their parents were gone, the girl who had lost the light in her eyes to a cruel illness when she was 18 and from then on had been forced to live in a world where people looked at her with pity, or, worse, contempt. He told her that he had hired so many people to care for his sister, had paid them generously, but with each person who came and went, his disappointment only grew more bitter, because not one of them had truly cared for Noelle. Some took advantage of his absence to siphon away money and secretly steal valuable things, while others treated the girl with cold indifference, speaking over her head as though she did not exist, seeing the care of a blind young woman as a tiresome burden they only endured for wages. He said that each time he saw his sister wounded that way, his heart twisted, and he swore he would never again allow anyone who did not truly care for Noelle to enter her life. That was why, when he needed to find someone new, he chose to wear the disguise of a silent hired man, because he believed that only when people thought the person before them could not speak, had no power, and had nothing to give, would they reveal who they really were, and he wanted to witness with his own eyes how the people who came here would treat his sister when they believed no one powerful was watching. He said he had never imagined that the woman who stepped out of a broken-down taxi in the middle of that snowstorm would give her only coat to a strange girl, that he had never imagined he would find the sincerity he had searched for all this time so quickly, and that the longer he stayed near her, the more he realized he had not only found someone kind for his sister, but had also found something for his own barren heart. Della listened to all of it in silence, and when he finished, she slowly turned to face him, her eyes still wet with tears, though the fury in them had softened into a deep sadness. She said she understood, that she truly understood, the pain of a brother who wanted to protect his sister from the cruelty of the world, and that she did not blame him for that. But then her voice sank as she went on, saying there was one thing he seemed to have forgotten, that he said he hated the dishonesty of the world he lived in, that he longed to find sincerity, and yet he himself had built an entire lie in order to obtain it. She asked him how a relationship could begin with truth when its foundation was built on a lie, how he could condemn that scheming world while he, too, was deceiving the people who were kindest to him, deceiving both her and the blood sister he loved. She said the kindness she had given was real, the concern she had felt for Cole was real, and precisely because it was real, discovering that everything had been hidden behind a mask was what made it hurt so deeply. Roland stood motionless before those words, because he knew she was right, and for the first time, He realized that no matter how noble his reasons had been, he had still wounded the very people he wanted to protect, and that truth, once hidden, would always leave wounds difficult to heal, no matter what reason one used to justify it. In the silence that followed those words of reproach, Noelle felt her way along the wall and found the porch, then spoke up, pleading for both of them to calm down because she had something to say. She turned toward Della, and in a gentle voice, she said she did not blame her brother, because she understood better than anyone the fear that had driven him to do what he had done. She said that ever since the day her eyes had sunk into darkness, she had tasted every kind of look the world could give, and she knew too well the feeling of being treated as a burden, of being spoken over as though she were not there, of being pitied so deeply that even her own existence began to feel like a nuisance. She said she understood why her brother had become so cautious and suspicious of the people who entered their lives, because he had been forced to watch her be hurt too many times, and love, even when clumsy and mistaken, was still love. Noelle's words came like a soothing balm, and Della looked at the blind girl with tears gathering in her eyes. Then she quietly sat down on the snow-covered steps, and for the first time since setting foot in this house, she opened her heart and spoke of the pain she had buried for so many years. She said she had not always been alone in this world, that she had once had a younger brother whom she loved more than her own life. After their parents died in an accident when she was only 16, she had carried the burden of raising him by herself, going to school while working all kinds of jobs just to provide him with food and clothing. But her brother had been born with a heart condition, and when he grew into his 20s, the illness worsened until he needed an expensive surgery to keep him alive. Della said she had run everywhere for help, sold everything she had, knocked on the doors of hospital after hospital, and begged. But the money needed to save her brother was far too much for a poor girl to gather. And what hurt her most, what had haunted her for years, was the way people looked at her brother as a case not worth caring about, a patient who could not pay, and therefore was not worth prioritizing for treatment. She said she had read in the eyes of more than a few people the cold message that the life of a poor man was cheaper than the life of someone else, that her brother did not deserve to be saved simply because he had no money, and in the end, he passed away when he was only 20, leaving her alone with a shattered heart and a rage toward the injustice of life. Della's voice choked as she said that because she had once seen with her own eyes a human being rejected by the world simply for being poor, because she had once stood on the other side of the line where people measured the value of a life by the money in a pocket, she could never look at another person being treated as though they were unworthy. She said that when she saw Noelle lost in the snowstorm that night, she did not think about who the girl was or what she might gain. She only saw a person who needed help, and to her, every person, whether blind, whether poor, whether abandoned by the whole world, carried a dignity that nothing could take away. She had treated Noelle with kindness not out of pity, but because she believed the girl deserved to be seen as a whole person, just as her brother had once deserved to live. Those words left both Roland and Noelle silent with emotion, tears streaming down the blind girl's face, and Roland felt his chest tighten before the painful story this woman had quietly carried for so long. He understood then that Della's extraordinary goodness had not appeared from nowhere, but had been forged in the greatest loss of her life. That she was kind to the world not because she had never tasted its cruelty, but precisely because she had tasted it to the very end, and had refused to let herself become hardened like it. In that moment, on the snow-covered porch, three people who had each, in different ways, been looked through and rejected by life, found in one another a profound understanding, and something even greater than love began to grow between them, the reverence for the dignity of a human being. The days that followed passed in an entirely different atmosphere, gentler and more honest, now that every mask had finally been taken off. Roland no longer wore work clothes or pretended to be silent, but he understood that to heal the wounds he had caused, words alone would not be enough, and he decided to show his remorse through action. For several nights in a row, he quietly sought out a skilled craftsman to restore the old piano in the sitting room, the very piano he himself carefully cleaned and tuned key by key, because he knew what music meant to his sister and to the woman who had given that joy back to Noelle. When the piano had been restored to perfection, He did something the hard man he had always been had never imagined he would do. He sat down and, in his own real voice, recorded a sincere apology for both Della and Noelle, the words he had kept hidden in his heart through all those silent days, so the two of them could listen again and again and understand the depths of what he felt. In that apology, he admitted every mistake he had made. He said that although his reason had been to protect his sister, he had still chosen the wrong way, and he begged for forgiveness, not with power or money, but with all the humility of a man who knew he had been wrong. Then he went to Della, and this time he did not stand before her as a boss or as a hired man, but as a human being laid bare with all his flaws. He asked her to give him a chance to know her honestly, without any more lies or tests, to begin again from the beginning as himself. He also told her that he had learned about her brother's story, and he offered to help her pay off all the debts she was still carrying from those days of trying to save him, as a way of sharing her burden. But Della gently shook her head. She said she appreciated his heart, but she could not accept that money, because if she accepted it, it would be as though everything she had done could be bought and sold, and her kindness had never been something to exchange for money. She said she would stay, not because he was rich or powerful, but because she truly loved Noelle, and because deep inside her heart, she was still attached to the man who had silently handed her a handkerchief in the greenhouse long ago. But she gave him two conditions. The first was that he had to promise to teach Noelle how to be independent, not to imprison her in luxury because of love and fear, but to let her live her own life, to stumble and rise again like anyone else, because that was the truest way to love her. The second, she said with a smile, was that no matter how powerful he might be, he should keep Cole alive inside himself, the man who knew how to listen in silence, the man who had learned that sometimes the heart hears more when the mouth stops speaking. Roland smiled and nodded, agreeing to both conditions, and in that moment, between two people life had once looked straight through, a new beginning was planted. That evening, Noelle sat down at the restored piano, and for the first time since the day her eyes had sunk into darkness, she played a complete piece, the clear, warm notes rising and spreading through the room. And when the final melody faded, Della and Roland stood side by side in silence, listening. They were two people who had once been lonely and had now found in each other, and in this girl a true home, a place where each person could be seen fully as who they were. Their story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that the value of a person never lies in money, status, or what they can see with their eyes, but in the heart they give and in the way they treat the weakest among us when they believe no one is watching. True kindness needs no condition and no repayment, and it is that kindness that becomes the light capable of healing wounded hearts and driving the darkness from every human life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share the video so you can listen to many more meaningful and engaging stories every day. How do you feel about this story? About Della's kindness, Roland's remorse, and Noelle's strength? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace and love filling every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.